Welcome to the Activate and Illuminate podcast with Mel. I'm your host, Mel, and together we'll be chatting with everyday people living extraordinary lives. So they've learned how to activate their potential and are helping to illuminate others. So I hope you will join me in listening to their journey. And if you like what you hear, and I think you will, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends and family. The world could use a lot more activation and illumination. Have a great day. Today, we're going to be talking about a heartbreaking story of the Sixties Scoop. Now, if you're like me, you may not know too much about it. Now, I had heard, of course, of residential schools, and I have heard a lot about, a lot of our dark history of Canada. However, I did not understand so much about this topic, and I still don't. And, I will try to do it justice, but honestly, I don't think there's any right way to do justice for this topic. So you're going to hear me talking to Robin Linn from Ontario. Now, she is a beautiful soul who has come through this experience with a passion to promote healing. Now, you're going to see how she has survived this, how she has transformed her life, and that is what I just found so beautiful about her story. So this will be a triggering topic, and I just want to say that if anyone hears this topic and is feeling, triggered, is feeling like this information is too much for them to handle, Robin has expressly said, I would like people to reach out to me. I would like people to reach out to their mental health providers. So if this topic is too much, just know that you can reach out for support, and she would absolutely love to connect. So we're going to get right into it, but I want to preface this by saying this will be part 1. This, we try to keep these episodes generally around an hour, and this episode is just too much content and too much to unpack in an hour. So there will be another part 2 with Robin, and I can't wait to get into that. But here is her story, and I would invite you to allow yourself to feel the impact of what has actually transpired over the last, decades, and was transpiring in Canada until 1996, which blew my mind. So let's get into it. Let's hear Robin, and then we'll go from there. And we'll have a lot to unpack over the next couple episodes. All right, join us. Hello and welcome. Well, today we have Robin Linn, and we are so excited to have her on. You guys, I met this wonderful lady not too long ago, but we connected, and I knew when I heard her story that you would want to hear it too. So, Robin, welcome to the Activate and Illuminate podcast, and we can't wait to hear your story, hear a little bit about where you are now. Maybe we'll just go into, you sharing a little bit about your story and how it's brought you to where you are now. And I'll just let you take it away wherever you want to start from.
Okay, well, thanks, Melanie.
Yeah.
So my story, where to start? I guess my story really starts, obviously, when I was born, but we'll go fast forward a little bit. When I was 4 years old, I and my 9 siblings were taken from our home on the Six Nations Reserve near Brantford, and we were all separated, not separated entirely. Some of us went to the same foster homes, but we were sent to live in non-Indigenous foster and adoptive homes in non-Indigenous communities. So I had lost touch with many of my siblings for many years. We weren't allowed to communicate with each other. We weren't allowed to communicate with our birth parent. And it was called the Sixties Scoop. And it was a Canada-wide plan, I guess, for lack of a better word, that Indigenous children were taken from their homes, sometimes without even their parents even knowing they were being taken. Children could be scooped from their backyards while they were playing. So that was what happened to me and my siblings. We were at home and the cars pulled up and we were herded into these vehicles and we were taken away. So that's the short version of my story. I've been on a healing journey now for many years, dealing with the trauma that resulted from that.
Yeah, and when we chatted, I had a, I know of the residential school system and I've heard of it, but like very seldom do we get to really understand it. And I mean, I don't understand it at all, but.
And I would like to be clear that the residential school system was different than the 60s Scoop. Because in the, I'm going to say probably the late 50s, early 60s, the residential schools were actually being shut down because the powers that be were actually coming to realize that they weren't in the best interest of the Indigenous children that went to them, and they were very expensive to run. So the residential schools were starting to be shut down at that point, but the schools were actually being used as child welfare facilities. So when I was, as I said, I was 4, when we were taken from my parents, there was apparently, my older sister told me, there was some discussion as to whether we would be sent to live at the residential school or whether we would be placed in foster and adoptive homes at that time. So it is, 60 Scoop is a completely different entity than residential schools.
This episode brought to you by bizbloomer.com. Bizbloomer.com is your friend to small and local businesses, a platform and directory that provides exposure and support to small ma-and-pa type stores or local entrepreneurs, helping them make an impact in their own local communities. BizBloomer.com is taking the corporate out of business and helping small businesses become relevant and essential again. Businesses can get started for free. Search for BizBloomer businesses in your area. Check them out today. BizBloomer.com. That's BIZbloomer.com.
Okay. So the widespread fear that must have been in the community, knowing that this could happen at any time, and distrust of did they know that it could happen at any time, or did it just happen and then it was realized?
It was, I was too young to know what the feeling in the community was, but I do know that when the residential school system was in place, for a while it was mandatory. Children had to be sent to the residential schools or they would be placed, the parents would be placed in jail for not sending them. So it was very much a mandatory education system. By the time the 60 Scoop came along, it was, I don't know what the feel in the community was, but the social workers that were working for these child welfare agencies had the right. They were given the go-ahead to go onto reserves and literally scoop children from their families. And, some of these children were taken from their mother's breast. Some of them were taken right at the hospital. Some of them were taken, as I said, children playing in their backyard, and they were just taken. And it was a terrible time in Canadian history following the residential school because these children were being taken in record numbers. And unfortunately, the provinces were being paid by the federal government for each child that was in their care. So it was a good incentive to have a lot of Indigenous children in their care.
So if you look back, what do you think the reason for this was?
It was I feel it was a twofold reason. When children were sent to the residential schools, they were raised in an institutional setting. They weren't shown any role models, what it was like to be a mother, what it was like to be a father, what families, what the whole demographic of a family would look like, and how families interacted with each other. So when these children got out of residential school, they had no idea. They had no idea how to be mothers. They had no idea how to be fathers. They had no idea how to be spouses to each other because they had no role models in the residential school system. When they were released, quite often they couldn't even go back to their home communities because they'd lost their ability to communicate with their family members. And so, but there was also the whole stigma around the trauma they suffered. A lot of them didn't want to go back to their home communities because they were so ashamed and embarrassed about what happened to them. And you have to keep in mind, nobody was talking about the abuse at that time. They thought they were the only one. So they, some of them knew that the priests or that even the nuns were sexually abusing classmates, but I don't believe that they knew the extent to which it was happening. And so there was a lot of stigma. There was a lot of shame about what happened to them. They didn't want to go home and face their families with that. But the other thing that started happening was when they started having babies of their own, they raised their children in much the same manner that they themselves had been raised. And so there was abuse. There was physical abuse. There was sexual abuse. There was emotional abuse. And so the child welfare agencies latched on to that and started removing the children. Now, I have to say, not all of the children that were removed were experiencing these kinds of abuses. Some of them were well cared for, they were loved, they were happy in their homes. And so it was just an across the board removal. It didn't seem to matter whether they were well cared for and happy or whether they really truly needed to be removed from their homes.
Well, now, did this happen fully across Canada in every single province?
Yes. And the sad part was that a lot of times they didn't keep any records. It was happening at such a rate that they didn't keep records of who the children were, where they were from, where they were sent, to what nation they belonged. So, and a lot of these children actually got sold across the border. They were sent to live in England, in Africa, like they were sent all over the world.
Slaves.
But yeah, and unfortunately, some of these children will never be able to find their way home again because of the lack of records that were kept.
Wow. You and I both live in Canada. I mean, we've known these things. I have friends who have, parents that have grown up in the residential system. And you hear about the atrocities and you hear about the trauma, and I'm sure we don't hear about it, most of it. But I don't feel like the average person in Canada has a grasp of what has happened. And I mean, there's so many, social issues that have come out of this. And it's easy to see, it's easy to pinpoint things that are wrong or things that could be better. But I don't think I have a grasp of what has happened.
And unfortunately, it's not something that's being taught in our school system. And a lot of people have heard about the residential school system, but a lot of that was because of the burials that brought a light to the residential school system. But the whole thing that I would like to emphasize is that there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma. And so those children, the initial children who went to residential school, started abusing their own children. But then their own children also went to residential school. So it wasn't safe for them at home. It wasn't safe for them at school. When you're raising a child in an unsafe environment, they have to come up with some type of coping mechanism, whether it's to become an abuser, whether it's to depend on drugs or alcohol. But now these children who have now become adults are raising children again in the same manner in which they were raised. So it's just an ongoing cycle. It aggravates me when I hear people say, well, that happened a long time ago. Can't you people just get over it? Well, the last residential school closed in Canada in 1996, which really wasn't that long ago. But the trauma continues. Just because the school closed doesn't mean all of a sudden, boom, that trauma went away. The trauma is still alive and well in Indigenous communities. And so we are still dealing with the aftermath of the residential school system and now of the Sixties Scoop.
And it's almost like, it almost accelerates in energy, even though it's stopped. The energetic signature of it is just compounding.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And that's what the intergenerational trauma is all about, because until the issue is dealt with and dealt with in a healthy manner, it's going to perpetuate itself. And so I have spent the past 30 plus years learning about the history of Indigenous peoples. I've been learning about our culture and our ceremonies and our traditions so that I can help stop, because the healing that I do for myself reverberates. It goes back through my mother, my grandmothers, my great-grandmother, and on and on and on. But it also goes forward. So I'm healing for my daughter, and I'm healing for my granddaughters, and I'm healing for their children and their children and their children. And that's why I'm doing it, because I want to be able to say that I was able to heal. And healing is an ongoing process. It's never, ever really finished, but I work at it, and I work at it maybe not every day, but pretty close. Pretty close.
Wow. Well, I have a question in my head. I've got so many places we could go with this. First of all, the family that you went into, tell us about them.
So I was a foster child. I was never adopted, and there is a difference, because when a family takes in a foster child, they will get a monthly check from the government to help to support that child. When a family adopts a child, then there is no money. There is you are adopting that child, you're making that child your own. And so you are solely responsible for raising that child and supporting that child and, all of its financial needs. So I was placed in a foster home when I was 4 years old. I was lucky because I stayed in the same foster home until I had my own child at 17. A lot of children weren't so lucky. When I was placed in the foster home, I was never adopted. When I was placed in the foster home, 2 of my oldest sisters were placed in the same home with me, but also 2 of my younger siblings, two of my younger brothers were placed with me. So my foster family had 3 children of their own, 3 birth children of their own. So I went from a family of 5 to a family of 10, basically.
Wow.
And my foster mother was addicted to, I believe it was morphine. She had been badly burned and she was addicted to morphine. And she found that trying to raise, 5 extra children was just too much. So my 2 younger brothers had to be placed in a different foster home. And then they were placed in a different foster home and a different foster home until they were finally adopted. And the foster family that I moved in with, there was always a feeling of us versus them in my mind. And I never, ever felt like I truly belonged to that couple as, a loving family member. I later in life, as I started thinking about it, I really truly believe that they did it for the money. And, when you're getting a monthly stipend for 5 children and then eventually 3 children, that makes a difference to a family's income. It makes a difference to whether the mother can stay home and work or stay home from work, stay home in the home and not have to go out to work. So, it does make a difference that way. And, as much as I wish I could say that it was a very loving, happy childhood, I can't. I didn't ever feel that. I felt fear for most of my childhood growing up. My foster mother's emotions were very volatile. She was a very angry woman. And I never knew what was going to set her off. And so I often felt like I was walking on eggshells a lot of my growing up years.
Well, and how did it work out for your brothers, your younger brothers?
Not well.
No.
When they were finally, they don't talk about it. One suffers from social anxiety so badly that he can't even go out to work. The other one has some serious addiction issues. I know that there was, in the foster homes before they were finally adopted, there was some really horrific abuses that they suffered. And, that has obviously affected them.
Well, from let's call it a policy standpoint, from a Canadian policy standpoint, what, in looking at what has happened and taking these children out of there, I mean, in my mind, the only reason for it could be to denounce culture, take people away from their, from their sovereignty, from their gifts, from their traditions, from their medicine, from their...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And that was actually the goal of the residential school system. It was to take the Indian out of the child, which is why they took them out of the home. Because if they had stayed in the home, they still would have had that family influence. They still would have celebrated their ceremonies. They still would have had their traditions. There was so many, like their spirituality. But when you take a child out of a home and you place them in a residential school, they have no interaction with any of that. They separated siblings from each other. So if a boy and his sister were sent to the same residential school, they weren't allowed to talk to each other because the boys were segregated from the girls. They weren't allowed to speak their own language. Quite often, you hear stories of extreme punishment. I read one story when I was in school about a child having a needle stuck through their tongue because they were caught speaking their own language. When families would come to visit, the staff of the school would stand outside the door to listen whether any of the Indigenous languages were being spoken, and the child would be punished after the parents left if that was the case. You have to keep in mind that some of these parents didn't speak English. So, of course, the only way to communicate with their child was through their native language.
Wow. So we connected recently in Arizona at an event, and you shared a little bit of your story, and you also shared that you're in the process of writing a book and finishing a book.
Yes.
And tell me about that process and what that has been for you.
It has been very cathartic, I have to say. So I'm actually in the process of editing. The first book I did, I wrote very, very much from a victim perspective. Oh, poor me, this is what happened to me, and this is what happened to me. And partway through it, I realized that is not what people hear. We're all victims of life. We've all got our stories, and there's nobody that has a better story or a worse story. We all have our stories, and that's just the way it is. That's just what life is. So I realized what I really need to focus on was the healing and how I healed and the various steps that I took. And as I said, healing is an ongoing process. So you can't say there's the finish line, I'm almost there. No, like it's an ongoing process. But I decided that I needed to share how I was healing. And one of the very, very first things, are you okay with me telling this?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
I want to hear it.
So one of the very first things that I learned was that I didn't love myself. And I never even thought about that. It never even occurred to me. And I had been with my daughter. She was about 18 at the time. And we were at a Reiki class. And on the way home from the Reiki class, we had all done Reiki on each other. And on the way home from the Reiki class, she said, Mom, you have to learn to love yourself. She says, you have to deal with some trauma that you've experienced in the past, and you have to learn to love yourself. And I'm thinking, my God, she's right. I don't love myself. But how am I going to learn how to love myself? How do you do that? Like, I had no idea. Nobody in my mind loved me. So how could I love myself? Like, I knew my daughter loved me, but as far as parental figures, I didn't feel that love. And so my big question was, how do I do this? And it took me a long time. It took me a lot of inner child work. It took me to reading as many self-help books as I could to try and figure out how I could learn to love myself. And one of the books that I read was by Louise Hay. And I can't remember the name of the book right now, but in it, she talks about doing an exercise with the mirror. When you look into the mirror and you say, I love you. And you just keep doing that every day. And it was very uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable for me to do that. But I kept doing it. And I kept doing it. But in the meantime, I'm also doing some inner child work, and I'm mostly inner child work at that point. And one day I did it. I looked in the mirror and I said, Robin, I love you. And I realized it was true. And I cried. Like, I broke down and I cried. I was so happy when I realized that was true. And, it's, as I said, it felt corny. It felt very uncomfortable. but it worked. So thank you, Louise Hay, wherever you are now, because that was, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't just that. It was also the inner child work that I was doing at the time. But yeah, so that was the starting point of, my healing journey. And another major thing that I feel is important to say was that I had to connect with my culture. I had to somehow connect with culture, because that was also a very important point in my healing journey and learning how to just be me and discover who me was. And it was just, I did a sweat lodge. It was a bunch of beautiful, beautiful, beautiful women. And they were so open and sharing, and it gave me permission to share stuff that I hadn't shared with anybody. And so that was one thing. But I was also put out on the land. This was a wonderful experience too. I had connected with a cultural counselor, and she put me on a fast out on the land. And it was at a place where I was guaranteed that nobody was going to interrupt me. That's not to say that there wouldn't have been animals that may have come to visit me, but there was no people there. And it was just me on the land for 3 days. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful experience as well. So also connecting with my creativity from a cultural perspective. So I do beading work. I do pottery with Indigenous themed designs on it, and that also helped. And I also do some leather working. I made my daughter a beaded drum bag for Christmas. And so it's things like that that really help on the healing journey as well.
So what do you think is first of all, I just have to say that's beautiful, because I mean, just imagine a world if everybody loved themselves.
Yes,
Like,
absolutely.
what a different world we would have if
Yes.
everybody had the tools, regardless of their circumstance, regardless of their upbringing, to learn how to love themselves.
And it is the most important thing anybody can do for themselves. The most important.
We were just at this event in Arizona, and one of the things that always, I'll just tell the listeners, if you're okay with it, what event it was.
Sure.
So we were at a Greg Braden, Bruce Lipton, Dr. Sue Porter, and Anita Morjani event. And in listening to the science of the resonance of fear and love, and what it actually means, and how far love goes out and how far fear goes out, and all the rest of it, and just what it actually does from a science perspective in your body.
Oh, yeah.
It's just fascinating to me. So, I mean, it's such a complex situation of now, what do we do? How do we, how do we move forward? I think a lot of what we see in different Native communities is, and I'm just going to say this from my perspective, and I might be completely, not understanding anything and out of line, but I liken, I was just actually listening just the other day to, they were talking about when a government provides resources for people, people lose their sovereignty. They lose their sovereignty. And as I was listening to that, I mean, I know so many of the compensation and different things that have happened, and I don't think there's, how do you even compensate for something like this? You can't. But what do you think the answer is? Because, from my perspective, that is not necessarily in touch with the situation at all. I look at a lot of resources being given and offered, and actually taking people out of their personal accountability and their sovereignty. Just But tell me your perspective.
I have to agree. When you are providing resources for anybody, of course, that takes away their sovereignty. And I think that was part of the plan of the government of Canada. Their view when this all began was that we were uncivilized, we were savages, we didn't understand anything, and they needed to look after us. And unfortunately, that's how it played out. I would like to say that to change the conversation, to change the narrative of what's happening, Canadians in general need to understand the history, the true history, not what's being taught in public schools, although it is getting better, but it needs to be the history as told from an Indigenous perspective, because history is always told from the side of the victor. And so history needs to be told from an Indigenous perspective as well as the colonizer's perspective, because one side of any story will not paint the whole picture. So, having said that, the important thing is that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have to understand their history and the role that they played in this history. And quit blaming. Like, it needs to stop. The judgment against Indigenous peoples needs to stop. We're not getting anywhere with the narrative that's being told. Some of it outright lies. For instance, there is a common misperception that Indigenous peoples get free education. I went through 4 years of university and I paid for every cent out of my own pocket. And the reason for that is because, A, I was a mature student. I didn't have any academic background that they could look at, like any recent academic background that the funding agency could look at to see whether I was a good risk or not. So the first year, they said I had to pay for it myself, but I could apply again the second year. By the time the second year came in, the nation to which I belong implemented a 100-mile radius or 100-kilometer radius that they were willing to fund. So if you lived outside of that radius, then your chances of getting funding were reduced significantly. I had to move outside of that radius because the school that I chose to go to was outside of that radius. So, and they had a lot of people who were applying for the funding. There's only so much funding to go around. Not everybody is going to be eligible for it. So it wasn't just me that had to pay for my own schooling. There are other Indigenous people who have to pay for their own schooling as well. So, a lot of people assume that we are getting a free ride on our education. Not true. Another one is we don't pay taxes. Again, not true. I pay taxes. Like, I don't live on reserve. If you live on reserve, different story. But the reserve right now, even if I wanted to, if I were single and I wanted to move down to the reserve, I couldn't because there's no place for me to move. The reserve is at capacity. They don't have any space. There's families, 2, 3 generations of families living in a house that was meant for one family. Capacity on reserves is really stretched to the limit right now. So there's so many things. I would like to say, though, that there are many, many, many nations across Canada that are developing their own economic policies and governance. So they are developing their economic, what's the word, development corporation. So they are looking at ways to have funding coming to them that doesn't rely on government funding. So, and many, many, many nations across Canada are doing that. So there is a strong push right now for Indigenous nations to reclaim their sovereignty.
Is there any type of like working together by the different bands? Like, do they collaborate and work together and, you know, access things in, you know, as a collective, or is it all individual and up to each individual band?
That's a good question. So I belong to the Six Nations of the Grand River. Six Nations, it's actually six nations. We are viewed as one band or one nation, but really there's six of us that live on the Six Nations reserve together. There is, I don't know the situation across Canada. I believe there are nations that are working together to achieve various goals, but I can't really speak to that because I really don't know. I do know that in my nation, it is very, very much divided even within the nation, because you've got traditional traditional council, and then you've got elected band council, and they seem to always be at odds with one another. And that makes me so sad, because we were never, ever meant to live like that. We were never meant to be fighting each other. We were meant to live together, to support one another, to live in unity. And I could say that for all of humanity, that's how we were meant to live. We weren't ever meant to have an us versus them mentality. And unfortunately, that is exactly what we have.
Yeah. On so many levels, I mean, just across every single, whether it's education, whether it's political, whether it's, you know, heritage, you know, I feel like I've on a different level than what has happened with what you're talking about with the 60s Scoop and the residential schools. But I feel like it is happening constantly, that the energy that is put into creating division in this country is much more than is being put into unity.
For sure. And unfortunately, it's not this country. It's all over the world.
Yeah.
There's us versus them all over the world. And when it comes right down to it, we're all connected. And I can't stress this strongly enough, that what is done to one is done to the whole. And we have to really remember why we're here. We have to remember, we have to wake up to the fact that we are all connected. And we aren't meant to be fighting each other. We're meant to be loving each other.
Yeah. And remember who we are.
Yes, exactly. Yes. We get so caught up in this earthly realm. It's like, at the end of the day, we all die. We don't really die. We just go on to another dimension. And, you know, if people remember that, it doesn't really matter the little nitpicky stuff that we can get our shorts in a knot over. That doesn't matter. It's the love you leave behind that matters.
Yeah, true. So tell us about this book, because now let's just preface this by saying, can I share a little bit about what you've shared with me so far?
Yes, absolutely.
So Robin has shared with me that she has written this book, and it's in the maybe the final completion stages, but it's not yet published, and that you are indeed looking for a publisher. So we'll just throw that out there in case a lovely publisher happens your way to hear this story and that could help out with that. So you were not wanting to self-publish. We'll just throw that out there. Now tell us sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Okay, so I was going to say the book, it does have a little bit of historical background. It does tell a little bit of my story and, some of the experiences that I've had from which I've needed to heal. But it's more about the healing aspect of it, because we have all heard, I don't want to say a million sob stories, but as I was saying earlier, everybody has a story. And my story isn't worse. It isn't better. It's just a story. And that's not what the focus of the book is. The focus of the book is, how did I become, going from a child of 4 years old who was afraid to walk into her house at the end of the day because she wasn't sure what mood her foster mother was going to be in, to being, I have to tell you a story.
Yeah.
I had a business partner at one point, and one of the things that she said to me was, "Robin, you never talk." And that hit me like a thunderbolt. And I realized she was right. And one of my coping mechanisms, one of my strategies, was that if I don't say anything, I'm not drawing attention to myself, and nobody can use anything I say against me in the future. Because that was one of the things my foster mother would do, or she would eavesdrop on a phone conversation and then berate me about the conversation. I was like 12 years old, teenage girl stuff. Like, it wasn't life-threatening. It wasn't anything that should have caused me anxiety. But all of these instances caused me anxiety as I was going out into the world and, becoming an adult. And so when I was, say, in a social situation, I would sit at the edge of a conversation. I wouldn't actually participate in the conversation. And so I never offered my opinion. I never shared anything about myself. And so when she said, "You never talk," I thought, my God, she is right. I don't. And it was all part of that fear of what I was saying would be used against me at some point. And it occurred to me that was a coping mechanism that I had adopted as I was growing up, because I would kind of blend into the background. I would try to make myself invisible, because that way nobody could yell at me for something I'd done. Nobody could, punish me for anything. And so one of the things that I had to learn how to do, was to be able to start sharing about myself with others. So when we were in Arizona, it was, "Okay, Robin, you're going to go. You're just going to be yourself. You're going to say what you feel like you need to say and let the chips fall where they may." So this is still an ongoing, it's an awareness that I have, that I can't just fall back on my time-honored coping mechanisms because they don't work anymore. And that was one of the things that I learned through my healing journey, was that those coping mechanisms that we develop as small children or as adolescents don't always work. forever. You have to overcome them. You have to develop new coping mechanisms or just let go of those coping mechanisms. I'm sorry, I got lost on what I was saying or what the
Yeah.
question was.
No, there's no question. I mean, this is just, and if I was to reflect on my experience of you, we're connecting and having this conversation because you were able to transcend that moment where you spoke up in a conversation where some of, these topics were being talked about, and you said, like, listen, like, you guys, sometimes there's another perspective. And had you not done that, we never would have been having this conversation.
Right.
So yeah, and yeah, your voice matters. Your voice is important. And I think your story and your book, and I'm in all transparency, I don't know the name of it. I haven't read it. I don't know anything about it, but I do know that just from what I've heard from you is that it will, and I love the perspective that you are coming from. You're sharing your story, and of course there's pain and there's different things in there, but you're coming from the perspective of healing and moving forward with love.
Yes. And forgiveness is key. Like, I held a great deal of resentment towards my mother for a long time. And one day we sat down and we had a heart-to-heart talk, and she shared her story with me, my birth mother. And she shared her story with me, and I felt so much compassion for this woman. Like, I thought, how could I have ever judged this beautiful soul? Like, she survived horrific things in her life. And I realized when I went to university that she didn't stand a chance. Her mother and her mother's mother, and probably beyond that, were victims of the residential school system. So they didn't know how to be mothers. They couldn't teach her how to be a mother. So my mother started having babies at 15 years old. How the hell would she ever have learned to be a mother? She couldn't. She couldn't have learned, because the situation that she grew up in was horrific. And there was no loving, there was no cuddles, there was no embracing, there was no bedtime stories, there was no anything that a child needs to be nurtured in the household that she grew up in. So how could I have expected that from her when she didn't even know how to do it herself? So I felt a great deal of compassion and was able to forgive her. Like, there was nothing to forgive, actually. Like, there was just absolutely nothing to forgive. But forgiveness is very, very much part of the healing process. I did have to find forgiveness for my foster mother, and that was a little more difficult. But I did it. I did do that. So, those are very important lessons that I've learned. As far as the book, I don't have a title for it yet. A couple of different titles have kind of come and gone, and I'm still waiting for that one that just speaks to me. And it's putting it out to the universe. Give me a title so we can get on with this book. But yes, it is mostly finished. I would say probably about 75 to 80% finished. I did talk a little bit about the history of Indigenous Canada, colonization, that whole piece, because a lot of Indigenous people actually don't even know their own history. So it's not just Canadians who don't necessarily know the history. A lot of Indigenous people, because we went to the same school systems that you guys went to, and it wasn't taught. So there's a little bit about that. But mostly my focus is on the healing aspect of my journey so far.
So aside looking in the mirror and telling yourself to love yourself, what would you suggest to people in the community that are looking for tools or resources from a traditional perspective to delve into
I would say connecting with my culture was very important. It was a very important aspect of my healing. And it doesn't have to be going to ceremony necessarily, because I found that on the reserve, those ceremonies feel very closed off to me. Like they don't feel welcoming and open. And there are communities that have welcomed their 60 Scoop survivors back with open arms. My community has not done that. They have not provided any resources for us. But connecting with culture through even through the arts and the crafts aspect of it makes a huge difference. Like it is very, very important probably for anybody on a healing journey, but specifically for Indigenous peoples on a healing journey. That was very important. The other thing, it's just, as I said, it's been a constant. I read a lot, and I believe that we all have to remember why we came here. And we can remember, like we all have it within us to remember why we came here, but we all chose to be here at this time in history. And it wasn't to suffer. It was not to suffer. It was to find that love and to grow from that love. And it was just, that is so, so important.
Well, Robin, I can't think of a better sentence or a better concept to leave this podcast on. We all came here to remember who we are and to love ourselves. I mean, if you could sum up anything in this world, we're all struggling to do that, aren't we?
We are.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a struggle. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's, we get so caught up in the price of groceries or the price of gas or, is it made in Canada or is it not made in Canada? Forget all of that. Just remember the love, and we're all humans. Okay? This whole divide that we have, Canadians versus Americans, or Catholics versus whoever, or Black versus white. Like, it's so ridiculous, these dualities, that it doesn't, at the end of the day, make any difference. We are all human beings, and we are all put on this earth to love one another, to help one another, to live in joy.
Well, my friend, I'm going to say thank you for that, because I don't think that there is a more profound concept that we could focus on right now. So sorry?
I was going to say, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be on your show, because this has been wonderful. And I didn't give you a link to anything, but if people wanted to contact me, they can send me an email, Robin, or put Melanie or podcast or something that I would know that you watched this in the subject line, and I will respond. I will not respond if it's not something in that subject line that I wouldn't recognize.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And for everyone listening, we will definitely have that in the show notes. You will be able to contact Robin. And I would like to say that, the instant this book is launched, we would love to, be sharing it out there with people. So thank you for sharing your story and for speaking up and for sharing your voice, because it truly matter.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin.